Hello, bonjour and welcome to your new Bonheur Private Wines video. Today I want to answer a question I get asked often and that a lot of wine people have in mind or are wondering about. What does the word reserve mean on a wine label? It's used abundantly in the US for more expensive wines generally, but not always, and supposedly for better wines. It's used a little bit in France, but rarely, while it's used in Spanish-speaking countries quite a lot, in Spain and South America, and it's also very common in Italian wines. So is this related to a special winemaking technique or process, or is it pure marketing? Let's explain. The word reserve itself etymologically comes from Old French, from the word réserver, which means to put aside, to set aside for a later consumption, or to reserve something for really special occasions or for special people. It's reserved for certain users. It makes sense in English, you understand it very well, and it does in French just the same. So in France, just like in the US, reserve wines are special wines, let's call them, that the winery has decided to set aside for a certain reason. But in those countries, there's no associated regulation, no obligation to do anything specific to a reserve wine more than a non-reserve wine. In other words, reserve is purely marketing term, and producers can bottle anything under these generic term. In practice though, as you know, reserve wines are generally of better quality and a higher price. In a winery's range, you'd have the standard wines, entry level, cheaper, then you'd have the reserve range, or the Grand Reserve, or the Vintners Reserve, made from better grapes, a little more attention to detail through the winemaking process at the winery perhaps, a little more aging in barrel as well, so more costly practices to obtain a better Vino overall. But generally, you'd have wines even pricier than the reserves above the reserve range, like single vineyards and very special ultra-premium limited edition wines, which reserve wines often aren't. Reserve is just a fancy, prestigious term that people understand for designating better wines, even though it doesn't represent anything specific. In France, if you see the word réserve on a label like a cuvée réservée or réserve spéciale, it's the same thing, it's just a name to characterize a level in the producer's range. Elsewhere though, reserve actually means something specific sometimes. In Spanish, the word for reserve is reserva. So unlike English or Italian, if you want to pronounce it correctly, it's got an S sound, reserva, and a B sound for the V, reserva. In Spain, unlike in the US or France, the designation reserva is strictly regulated and corresponds to a minimum aging time in oak. To use the term, therefore, wineries have to mature their vinos for a certain number of months in a barrel, and it's controlled and enforced by local wine authorities. So it's a law. It's written by law. In Spain overall, you have 3 levels of wine maturation in oak. The term crianza is for wines aged for 6 months in wine barrels, so half a year, a little bit of time in oak, but not very much, while Reserva is for wines aged for at least 12 months in oak. Then you have the Gran Reserva, the Grand Reserve, for wines aged for 18 months, so longer than Reserva. Where it can get a little bit confusing is that you have 2 more prestigious appellations in Spain that have longer minimum required time spent in oak for the same terms. That's the region of Rioja and Ribera del Duero, two of the best appellations for red wines in Spain. Crianza there is for 12 months in barrels and 12 months in bottle before release. Reserva for 12 months in barrels and 24 months in bottle. Gran Reserva for wines aged for at least 2 years in barrels and 3 years in the bottle. So it gets a little bit confusing with numbers and ages, but what you have to remember is that Reserva wines and Gran Reserva correspond to much longer time spent in oak, and To achieve this, to achieve the right balance with so many months spent in oak, you have to have, as a winemaker, better wines, bigger body, bigger tannins to start with, because they're going to spend longer in oak. So the Reserva wines are denser to start with, and they get more oak influence. So they're better wines, and wineries do have to spend the money, better grapes, more oak, more time spent at the winery to make Reserva wines. Now in South America, where they also speak Spanish, the term Reserva is also used, but there is no associated regulations, and it's very much like in the US, it's just marketing, just a meaningless word written on a label. In Chile and Argentina, I'd say it's even used more loosely sometimes than in the US. Not always. Some wineries use the term Reserva for their best excellent wines, but some bodegas stick the word Reserva on even entry-level wines and labels. As an example, the biggest wine producer in Chile, called Concha y Toro, makes a huge global brand of wines called Casillero del Diablo, of which they make and sell tens of millions of bottles all around the world, and it has the mention it's called Reserva on the label. Even though it's more of a bottom shelf $10 type of wine, it's there, supposedly Reserva Cabernet, even though it's really cheap. And finally, in Italy, the word Riserva is pronounced Riserva. And there too, the term corresponds to an actual minimum legally required time of aging before the bottles are sold. So it's controlled. The difference with Spain is that it doesn't have to be aged in actual oak barrels. It can be aged in larger oak vats, which gives less oaky flavors, because Italians have traditionally used oak vats more than barrels for a more controlled oak influence. But it's essentially, again, time spent maturing at the winery in a wooden container, vat, or a barrel. Again, here wineries not only age these wines for longer, but the wines being more expensive, the Reservas, they use their best vineyards and their best grapes to make the Reserva wine, so they generally are better and more concentrated and more expensive wines. Now, the term Reserva is used only in some of the best and most famous appellations in Italy. It's not something you find everywhere because it has to be controlled. So some of the top appellations in Italy, like the famous Chianti, obviously, in Tuscany. So you have sometimes some wines with such a long name called Chianti Classico Superiore Riserva. Other Tuscan appellations, very prestigious, use the term Reserva, like Brunello di Montalcino or Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. Other areas of Spain outside of Tuscany use it as well. Only the top appellations in Piedmont, Barolo and Barbaresco. You'll have also in Veneto around Verona, the beautiful city of Verona, you'll find Amarone della Valpolicella also use the term Reserva. So a few very specific high-end wines in Italy use Riserva, and a few other small ones as well that I'm just gonna skip for here. Here you have it. Now you know everything about the terms réserve in France, reserve in the US and English-speaking countries, reserva in Spanish-speaking countries, and riserva in Italy. Now you pretty much know it all. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon in the wonderful world of wine. Cheers.